Okay, so welcome everyone to this online Poetry East. We're just gathering. We've got 53 people already online, so welcome to all of you. Welcome to you if this is your first time to the London Buddhist Centre. A special welcome to you if this is the first time you've ever been to a poetry event. Do tell me in the chat box if it is, because I bet you it is for some people. It's quite a rarity that people go to poetry events. I know quite a lot of people who go to them, but I know an awful lot of people who don't. So yeah, do let me know if you're the first time to a poetry event. Welcome to you if you're on the home retreat. This is the final full day of the home retreat. So we're going to be having a puja later on this evening at 9 o'clock. So I'm going to be exploring poems, and then we'll have a break in the middle of my exploring of poems, and then we'll have a puja at 9 and a break before that. So plenty of time for you to relax, to get yourself a cup of tea. Do get yourself a cup of tea for this. This is supposed to just be enjoyable. Yeah. This is just like, what a night is it? Saturday night. We're just chilling out. This is just enjoyable. We're just going to have pleasure. We're not doing anything terribly earnest. We're trying to explore life through poetry. I still would like to write a book called Poetry as a Way of Life. That's my aim. And the title of this is The Purpose of Poetry. But I'll say something about that when we start. So make sure you're comfortable. Turn the lights down. Think of it as being just an evening of, I don't know, relaxation. You can turn the lights down. You can get yourself a cocoa. And then later on, you will do a ritual. But just for now, let's just enjoy ourselves. Those of you who've been on the retreat a lot of you have been expressing a lot of appreciation, which I myself feel appreciative for. A lot of appreciation. So those of you on that retreat, some of you I know have found it really quite intense and strong, and it's I don't know, it's touched you in ways that you didn't expect. A few people are saying, I just didn't realize that was what meditation was about. I didn't know that that's what it could do. I didn't know that what it could reach, which is just great. That's what I'd hope. Yeah, that's what I'd really hope. So tonight is just, relax and enjoy, and let's hear some poems and explore the purpose of poetry. So I make it 7 o'clock, so we're now going live. So welcome everyone to Poetry East. First thing I want to say is, if you've never been to a Poetry East event, we run Poetry East from the London Buddhist Centre. We have been running it now for about 10 years, and we've interviewed people like the Irish novelist Colm Tóibín. We've interviewed the sculptor Anthony Gormley, the prize-winning American poet, very important American poet, Jory Graham. We've interviewed Wendy Cope. We've interviewed Kai Miller just recently. Just the other day, I interviewed Sigrid Nunez about her national award winning book, The Friend, which I'd very much recommend. We've interviewed Michael Longley, Don Patterson, so many names, so many names from theatre. We've written Michael Frayn from theatre. So do join the Poetry East mailing list, the easiest way for me to tell you about events, including online events. And I'm hoping to do more of these online events now. I've been a bit slow getting around to it because the Buddhist Centre has needed to get online, and that's frankly more important. But I'm hoping to run more of these online events. So the easiest way for me to contact you is for you to join our mailing list, and Iplit will put that onto the chat just now. And so welcome everyone. So this evening is exploring the purpose of poetry. Come in. Some people are coming from my community. I live upstairs at the Buddhist Centre here, and I invited them all down, but so far it's not looking great. But anyway, they're washing up, so that's fine. That's fine. They're washing up as long as they've got a good reason. Okay, so what I want to explore is the purpose of poetry. I don't know about you. I mean, I read masses of poetry. Hardly anyone I know reads very much poetry nowadays. It seems to have, in some ways, slightly disappeared. Some people are saying it's become ever more popular, but that's in particular forms, you know, like the spoken word and so on. But I'm hoping this evening gives you an introduction to poetry, and it deepens your appreciation of poetry if you already are one of those rare creatures that like poetry. And I want to do that by exploring the work and the lives of 4 American poets. Quite why I've chosen these 4, I don't know. They're just all poets I like, basically. So I haven't got some great plan on you. I'm not trying to sort of say this is what you need to be reading. You read what you like. This is what these are the people I've been reading and the people that I've been, you know, very, very moved by and love, even love. Yeah. So yes, and if this is a new event for you to go to a poetry event, you might be heartened by the start of a poem by the poet I'm going to first explore, Marianne Moore. One of her poems starts, "Poetry, I too dislike it." Yeah. So if she can say that, anyone can say that. Yeah. Poetry, I too dislike it. So I'm going to start with Marianne Moore. Here's a picture of her when she was young. Quite an unusual woman. I'll talk to you about her life and her work. But I thought I'd kick off with just a short poem of hers, just to sort of get us going. And then I'm going to explore slightly longer one. I mean, none of the poems I'm exploring this evening go very far over 1 page. They're all short. But I thought I'd just kick off with one just to sort of warm you up to poetry. Yeah? And it also impacts on some of the things I want to say about her and her life, Marianne Moore, American poet. So, silence. My father used to say, superior people never make long visits, have to be shown Longfellow's grave or the glass flowers at Harvard. Self-reliant like the cat that takes its prey to privacy, the mouse's limp tail hanging like a shoelace from its mouth, they sometimes enjoy solitude and can be robbed of speech by speech which has delighted them. The deepest feeling always shows itself in silence, not in silence, but restraint. Nor was he insincere in saying, make my house your inn. Inns are not residences. There you go. What do you make of that? I don't make anything of it at all. I don't know what she's talking about. But I think it's lovely, isn't it? It's like a little firework of speech. It's like a little sparkler of speech, you know. It crackles, doesn't it? My father used to say, superior people never make long visits, have to be shown Longfellow's grave or the glass flowers at Harvard. All those lovely consonants, that sparkly, it's very, very, just the sound of it is beautiful. And sometimes with Marianne Moore, that's about as far as you can get, frankly, it's just the sound of it. But the poem I want to explore is I want to say a very famous poem, but you've probably never heard of it. But about 3 people who read poetry have all read this poem. It's called The Fish. It was written in 1921. Marianne Moore was born in 1887. She died in 1972. So that gives you a bit of a sense of her life. I'll read the poem, and then what I'll do is I'll explore the form of the poem a little bit. I'm very interested in form, and I want to help you see the form of poems, because that gives you a sense of poetry at its best, just how miraculous poetry is. And I'll also tell you a bit about her life, because I think that opens the poem out to you. Yeah. So really all we're going to do is this for this evening. I'm just going to read a poem, tell you about the poet, tell you a bit about the form, then read the poem again, and then we'll move on to another poem. So another poet. It couldn't be simpler, yeah? And apart from if you're trying to read Marianne Moore. I wish I had a lovely American accent as well, a particular sort of very clear, clarified American accent, but I don't have that. I have a blurry English accent. So just to say, the title of this poem is The Fish, but as with many of her titles, the title runs on into the poem. So you get the title, but then the sentence runs on, yeah? So see what you make of this. If you thought the first one was strange, have a go at this one. The Fish. The fish wade through black jade. Of the crow blue mussel shells, one keeps adjusting the ash heaps, opening and shutting itself like an injured fan. The barnacles, which encrust the side of the wave, cannot hide there, for the submerged shaft of the sun, split like spun glass, move themselves with spotlight swiftness into the crevices, in and out, illuminating the turquoise sea of bodies. The water drives a wedge of iron through the iron edge of the cliff, whereupon the stars, pink rice grains, ink bespattered jellyfish, crabs like green lilies, and submarine toadstools slide each on the other. All external marks of abuse are present on this defiant edifice. All the features of accident, lack of cornice, dynamite grooves, burns, and hatchet strokes, these things stand out on it. The chasm side is dead. Repeated evidence has proved that it can live on what cannot revive its youth. The sea grows old in it. You get it? It's very beautiful, isn't it? I mean, whatever you make of the meaning, and apparently Wallace Stevens, who's a poet I won't be exploring tonight, but another American poet, Wallace Stevens, said that he didn't even try, and he's like massively intellectual poet. He said, I didn't even try, I just enjoyed the sounds, the beauty of the sounds, yeah? The fish wade through black jade. Of the crow blue mussel shell, one keeps adjusting the ash heaps, opening and shutting itself like an injured fan. So the first thing I want to say is about the form. I don't know whether you can see it. Can you see that on screen? So there's the form. It looks gorgeous on the page. Her work always looks beautiful on the page. So I'll explain the form of that. Well, it looks beautiful to me anyway. So she writes in what's called syllabics. A lot of her poems are in syllabics. So that means that she counts the syllables. So each verse of this poem is in the same syllable count. Yeah. So the first line is one syllable long, and then you get 1, 3, 9, 6, 8. Yeah. Each verse that you can see there is in that form of 1, 3, 9, 6, 8 syllables. So every single verse is in a strict syllable count like that. Just to make it more difficult for herself, it's also in rhyme. Yeah. So you see that wade rhymes with jade, keeps rhymes with heaps. Very straightforward rhymes. So that's you scan that as saying A, B, B. A just means A rhymes with A, B rhymes with B. So jade, wade, wade, jade, keeps, heaps. Yeah. A, B, B. And then that final line, which is 8 syllables long, has no rhyme. You mark that with an X. So if you to write the form down, you can write it like I've written it down on a bit of paper. You can write a kind of sum, which says 1, 3, 9, 6, 8, A, B, B, X. Yeah, that's the form. That tells you all you need to know about the form. Of course, the question is, why did she choose such a difficult form? So not only she used syllabics, which is mad enough, because with syllabics, you can't hear them. You can't hear the pattern of syllabics. So when I read it, you won't have noticed, oh, it's in syllabics. You might have heard some of the rhymes, but many of them you wouldn't have heard. So not only has she given herself the problem of the syllabics, which is difficult. I've never written in syllabics myself and can't frankly see the point. It developed about this time, she writes this in 1921, it develops, often it was developed as a way of getting you out of writing in pentameter, which we'll come to in a minute, which is a classic mode of writing. Once you write in pentameter, and I've written in that quite a lot, you almost can't get out of it. Anything you try and write, you end up writing it in pentameter or in some kind of meter. So one of the ways in which syllabic was used by modernist poets like Marianne Moore, and she's a famous modernist poet like Ezra Pound, like Eliot and so on, and she's one of the most important ones. She's often thought about as being the greatest American poet after Emily Dickinson, the 20th century poet. She's weirdly not as well known as she ought to be in the UK, at least. I've never managed to persuade many of my friends to like Marianne Moore, including Jan Avocha. But anyway, he's here, so I can tease him. But yes, it's interesting. Why such a difficult form? Interesting to then use that lens to look back briefly at her life. It's difficult to say about her life. She had a brother, and she lived with her mother all of her life until her mother died. She was the editor of a very important modernist poetry magazine called The Dial. She lived in what one writer has described as ostentatious poverty. She lived in Brooklyn, and she had no money. Her mother had no money. Apparently they used to, her mother and her would have a meal together, sitting on either side of a bathtub with a little camp table put in between them. Yeah. So if you imagine Marianne Moore, and you can hear her voice, like this sort of school mom voice. She's got quite a strong religious sense, like Emily Dickinson, a very unconventional one, perhaps, but a strong one. You can imagine her sitting opposite her mother, having tea. She was a mentor to Elizabeth Bishop, and I'll be coming on to her poems in the second half. A very, very important influence on Elizabeth Bishop and her mentor and friend. They were friends all of their life. She lived, so Marianne lived with her mother all that time. Her mother's rather dominating. In fact, one time, Elizabeth Bishop sent a wonderful poem that's one of her masterpieces. And Marianne Moore didn't like it because it mentioned water closets, which she thought was unseemly in a poem. So she and her mother got the poem and rewrote it all and sent it back to Elizabeth Bishop. And how that friendship survived, I don't know. But her mother, Elizabeth Bishop's mother, was rather difficult. The dreadful story, of course, of Marianne Moore's life is her father. Her father had very, very bad mental health problems. And in fact, the marriage between her mother and father broke down before Marianne was born. And he was in an asylum. So it's interesting that poem. My father used to say, superior people never make long visits. So she's not telling the truth there. She doesn't mean her father. She never met her father. Her father was very, very ill, and he suffered from that kind of mania that makes you think that you're, I don't know, Jesus or something like that. So one of the terrible things about him is he cut his right hand off whilst he was in hospital. The religious saying is, the Christian saying is, if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off. And he did cut it off. And he said he didn't regret that. So somewhere in the back of this poem is that tragic story. Also, the Moore family are terribly, that even their estate, it's been quite difficult to publish things about Marianne Moore because the estate is so careful of what's said. But my experience of the family, I've read a biography of Marianne Moore, they're very inward looking. They have all these funny pet names for each other. They're very, those families that you think are too close. For me, it strikes me as something unhealthy. No one knows about Marianne's sexuality. The tendency now is to assume that she's a lesbian, but probably never came out. She was trying to make her voice heard in a world where poetry was dominated by very male voices. When she says poetry, I too dislike it, she partly meant highly sort of puffed up poetic speech, sort of Tennysonian-like speech, which, as you can hear, was completely foreign to her. So when you get this poem, you get part of my own reading of Moore is that she uses these very elaborate techniques to find a way of saying things that she can't say. So one of the terrifying things is to do what happens when you put this schema onto this poem. So if you remember the section, all external marks of abuse are present on this defiant edifice. So in some way, it seems to be a self-portrait in a very changed way. All external marks of abuse are present on this defiant edifice. All physical features of accident, lack of cornice, dynamite grooves, burns and hatchet strokes, these things stand out on it. So I think she might be trying, and she might not even be conscious of this. She's trying to, it's about endurance. It's about living in great difficulty and pain and not being able to express it. So much so that she's had to translate it into this kind of submarine story. But what an incredible moment you've got in this, because you have to have this syllable count. Sometimes it means that you break the word break the word across the line. So all external marks of abuse are present on this defiant edifice, all physical features of accident. So the word accident is broken over 2 lines. So it starts ax, and then the next line cident. And then she rhymes axe with back. So you get that A rhyming scheme. So I don't know whether this is conscious, but this is a terrible way of cutting the word accident in half, with, as it were, a word axe. Somewhere this terrible story of her father, emblematic perhaps of these hatchet strokes that we come to. Now this is only one way of reading it, and she might be horrified of this way of reading it, because another way of reading it is just to enjoy the language and the mystery of underwater. It's a whole other world. It's a world that is more alien to us than the moon. And, apparently we've gone to less of the ocean than we have to other planets. So partly she'd be thinking that she's doing that, but you can't help thinking it's also about endurance, about difficulty. Good to bring some science there into poetry. A little tiny bit, just a little toe. It's not really science, no. It's kind of Facebook, really, isn't it? Okay, so I'll read it one more time and then we'll move on to our next poet. But just see if you can enjoy the language. Yeah? You might feel a bit more for it now you hear it a second time. The fish. The fish wade through black jade. Of the crow blue mussel shells, one keeps adjusting the ash heaps, opening and shutting itself like an injured fan. The barnacles, which encrust the side of the wave, cannot hide there, for the submerged shaft of the sun, split like spun glass, move themselves with spotlight swiftness into the crevices, in and out, illuminating the turquoise sea of bodies. The water drives a wedge of iron through the iron edge of the cliff, whereupon the stars, pink rice grains, ink bespattered jellyfish, crabs like green lilies, and submarine toadstools slide each on the other. All external marks of abuse are present on this defiant edifice. All physical features of accident, lack of cornice, dynamite grooves, burns, and hatchet strokes, these things stand out on it. The chasm side is dead. Repeated evidence has proved that it can live on what cannot revive its youth. The sea grows old in it. Okay, so that's a very, very brief moment with the wonderful poet Marianne Moore. There's a Faber selected of Marianne Moore. She's really worth reading. But you can see she's quite difficult to read out loud. It's so, I haven't got really the mouth for it. You need a different kind of, that particular voice for it. So now I want to explore a very different poet, and we'll do this, and then we'll have a cup of tea, a little break, and then I'll explore another 2. I'll just explore a very different poet, a poet that I don't know as well, Anthony Hecht. I've only just recently read this very beautiful selected poems in this lovely edition. I really love these editions. I've got another selected like this of James Merrill that we'll be coming to at the end of the evening. Anthony Hecht was born in 1923 and died in 2004. Crosses over with Marianne Moore. crosses over with all the poets that we're reading today, but yeah, died in 2004. So I'm going to read you a poem, and it feels very, very different. It's a stark contrast with what you've just heard from Marianne Moore. And then again, I'll say something about him and about his life. The Book of Iorek. The Dow's coals, sorry, I can never get that first line right. The doused coals fume and hiss after your meal of grilled brook trout, and you saunter off for a walk down the fern trail, doesn't matter where to. Just so that you're weeks and worlds away from home and among midsummer hills have set up camp in the deep bronze glories of declining day. You remember peacefully an earlier day in childhood. Remember a quite specific meal, a corn roast and bonfire in summer camp. That summer you got lost on a nature walk. More than you dared admit, you thought of home. No one else knows where the mind wanders to. The 5th of August, 1942. It was morning and very hot. It was the day they came at dawn with rifles to the home for Jewish children, cutting short the meal of bread and soup, lining them up to walk in close formation off to a special camp. How often you have thought about that camp, as though in some strange way you were driven to, and about the children and how they were made to walk. Iorek, who had bad lungs, who wasn't a day over 5 years old, commanded to leave his meal and shamble between armed guards to his long home. We're approaching August again. It will drive home the regulation torments of that camp Iorek was sent to, his small, unfinished meal, the electric fences, the numeral tattoo, the quite extraordinary heat of the day. They were all forced to take that terrible walk. Whether on a silent, solitary walk or among crowds, far off or safe at home, you will remember helplessly that day and the smell of smoke and the loudspeakers of the camp. Wherever you are, Iorek will be there too. His unuttered name will interrupt your meal. Prepare to receive him in your house someday. Though they killed him in the camp they sent him to, he will walk in as you're sitting down to a meal. So this is a deeply disturbing, deeply chilling poem. I'll say something about Hecht first before I talk about the form of the poem and some of its terrible meanings, all of which make a whole. Form and content in poetry are expressions of each other. When you write in a particular form, and Anthony Hecht is well known as being a formalist. It's a bit of a silly word, this word formalist, because it's as if there's such a thing as a non-formalist poet. What it will come to mean is he mostly writes in strict metrical forms, using rhyme and meter and so on. He doesn't use rhyme in this, but he uses a strict metrical form and a strict form, what's called a closed form. In other words, a form you have to adhere to. But when you choose a form, it's not that you choose it, it's the content wants to be in that form, and I'll say something about that in a minute. But yeah, so Anthony Hecht, born in 1923, he signed up for the US Army when he was 19. He comes from a fairly wealthy German Jewish background. He's American, but comes from a German Jewish background, fairly wealthy, although they lost a lot of their money in the war, most of their money in the war, as so many did. You know, wars aren't just to do with the event. They're to do with all that follows from war. Yeah, so he signed up at the age of 19. Imagine being 19 and signing up. He joined the 97th Division, and he was sent to Le Havre in 1945 and marched into Germany from Le Havre. And on April 23rd, 1945, he was part of a force that liberated Flossenburg, which is a concentration camp, an annex of Buchenwald. Yeah? So he was among those soldiers to first discover the horrors of the Holocaust. So he was a very, very young man. And, this left, as you can imagine, a terrible mark on his life. He had at least, well, it's described as a mental breakdown, but later on in life, the strains of this time. He also interviewed the people. So you can firsthand hearing some of the most terrible stories that human beings have ever heard being poured into his ear, facing so much malevolence. One of the terrible injuries of human beings is when they have to face malevolence. It's interesting, my own teacher, Sangharakshita Bhante, the founder of this movement, late in life, not long before he died, there was quite a few reflections that he wrote about evil. Buddhism asks us to reflect about suffering a lot. It doesn't tend to talk about evil so much or malevolence. But one of the terrible things in life is the fact of human malevolence and how destructive it can be if you have to face that. If you've ever had to even talk to somebody who's feeling a lot of hatred towards you, it's very, very difficult to look into malevolence. Or if you hear something written about you, somebody shared something unpleasant about you on Facebook, even that is very, very difficult to bear. So facing malevolence, it has a terrible cost for human beings. You have to be very, very strong indeed. He said, for instance, that he'd used to wake up for years shrieking in the middle of the night. And like my old friend Mohananda, whose mother was in Auschwitz, he ended up reading and compulsively reading all this literature about the Holocaust as a way of trying to understand it. When he was demobbed, he said he was drunk for 5 days solid straight away. And this story, this terrible experience he had, stayed with him in all his life. And what do you do? How do you write about that? Can you write about that? There's famously people saying, after the Holocaust, there can be no art. Painting went flat after that. Deep space in painting disappeared, and you end up with Rothko and Pollock, and painting flattened, as if we couldn't imagine space anymore. But if Anthony Hecht actually met those people, heard those terrible stories, had that poured into his ear, and of course it could so easily have been him, Jewish himself, and the complication of that from a German Jewish background. These are forces that are pressed into his life. I mean, Hecht's poetry is this wonderful meeting. He's got this beautiful, he's very literate. One of the poem I'd really, really recommend, a long, long poem called Venetian Vespers, which was his, I think it's called Venetian Vespers, his favorite poem. All of his poems are wonderful. I'd very much recommend this selected. Can't find it now, but they're some of the most frightening poems you'll ever read. There's another poem in here, which is a very famous poem, Second World War poem, which is just too terrible to read out loud, I think. A wonderful poem, but utterly terrifying. He has this willingness to, he wrong foots you. He creates beautiful language, which then makes you think that you're in one world, and he'll suddenly crash in with another language. So I thought, let's see how he's done that. So the doused coals fume and hiss after your meal of grilled brook trout, and you saunter off for a walk down the fern trail. Doesn't matter where to, just so you're weeks and worlds away from home, and among midsummer hills, a set-up camp in the deep bronze glories of declining day. Do you hear that? It's very Tennysonian. It's the voice of poetry. It's the deep bronze glories of, you can imagine it in that voice, the deep bronze glories of declining day. It's got that, I saunter off for a walk down the fern trail. It doesn't matter where to. He's consciously, and that word saunter, which is actually brilliant and later becomes terrifying. What troubles that first verse? Because the reader thinks, I know where we are. Nice, poetic thing, the only thing that troubles it is that difficulty in saying the first line. The doused coals fume. It's very, very difficult to say. Most poets would edit that out. They'd find a mate, but it's doing something. It troubles that first line. But after that, you bump over that a little bit, and you've got a fern trail, and you saunter off, and deep bronze glories. And then the second verse, you remember peacefully an earlier day in childhood. Remember a quite specific meal, a corn roast and bonfire in summer camp. So by now the reader is, oh yes, yeah, how nice. Yeah, I remember things like that, corn roast, summer camp. If you're an American reader, summer camp must be very, very evocative for anyone in childhood poems. My whole community teased me about how much I write about my childhood. A corn roast and bonfire in summer camp. That summer you got lost on a nature walk. Now that sounds very innocent, but that summer you got lost on a nature walk. If you're very attentive, that could be worrying, but because the setup is so benign, it probably isn't. And then more than you dared admit it, so you suddenly get that word dared, you thought of home. And then this very crucial line, which is only the end of the second stanza, no one else knows where the mind wanders to. Again, it sounds innocent enough, but then you jump to the next verse, so you go over that white space. That's what it looks like on the page. It looks very like a classical poem, which it indeed is. It's very formal, and I'll talk to you more about the form in a minute. So you jump that white space to the 5th of August, 1942. So now we've gone back. So this is somebody, and he's remembered his childhood far back. Then actually, without you quite realizing, he's jumped forward. He started in the present, gone back to the childhood. It all seems perfectly lovely just now, very poetic. You're very used to this kind of stuff. The 5th of August, 1942. It was morning and very hot. Absolutely key, simple statement. It was the day they came at dawn with rifles to the home for Jewish children, cutting short the meal of bread and soup, lining them up to walk in close formation off to a special camp. Now, do you see how horrifying that verse break has become? He's used the verse break to push you into another world, which you just didn't see coming. You might have thought there's something about the Book of Yorick, the title, certainly sounds very serious, but you've been lulled so much into poetry and nostalgia and summer camp and corn roasts that you didn't expect to be thrust, like he was as a young man, into horror. It embodies his own experience. He was like anybody else, just like the people in that camp, thrust in a verse break into unimaginable horror. So he won't introduce it, he won't soften it. It's just the 5th of August, 1942. It was morning and very hot. It was the day they came at dawn with rifles to the home for Jewish children. A terrifying, thing. So I could almost go through it word by word. It's so good. It really is so good. How often you have thought about that camp? So this is no trauma voyeurism. When I interviewed Michael Longley, the wonderful Irish poet, he was talking about troubles trash, as he called it. He really disliked people using trauma and the troubles in Ireland, in his case, to come up with a nice turn of phrase. He thought it was, immoral. Yeah. This is a man who's lived through it. So he's then saying, how often you have thought about that camp, as though in some strange way you were driven to. This is a man speaking who used to wake up every night shrieking, got drunk for 5 days after got demobbed, became mentally ill, and about the children and how they were made to walk. And you see how walk is starting to work, how what was a saunter Now they're being made to walk, and they're children. So that incredible word earlier on, and you saunter off for a walk. How innocent that seems. And you saunter off for a walk down the fern trail, like Dylan Thomas. How lovely. You saunter off for a walk down the fern trail. Now you are made to walk, and your children. And Yolik, who had bad lungs, who wasn't a day over 5 years old, commanded to leave his meal and shamble between armed guards to his long home. Now, by now, you might be starting to see there's something going on here. There's a form here. There's something. We keep going. We're going round and round something, aren't we? And that's what we are. This is what's called a sestina. It's a closed form. It's a strict form. It's got strict rules which to write. And this is a classic sestina. He takes some beautiful liberties with it, which I'll tell you about in a minute. They're not liberties. They're creative reimaginings. Take some lovely kind of liberties with it, but pretty much a very strict sestina. It's become very popular because Elizabeth Bishop wrote 2 marvelous sestinas. Very, very difficult to do because it's quite a long form. It actually goes over the page, 6 verses of 6 lines, and then a 3-line envoy. You can see that. So it goes like that, and it goes over quite a long poem to write, actually. And most sestinas haven't got enough to warrant it. But do you see how what you actually get is what you need to notice with the sestina? It's to do with the end words, yeah? So the first verse, the end words of the first verse are this: meal, walk, to, have, camp, day, yeah? So they become 6 key words: meal, walk, to, have, camp, day. And then they're repeated in a set sequence. So if you think of that as being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, they're then repeated in this sequence: 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Yeah. So meal, walk, to, have, camp, day. Day, meal, and so on. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And they have to repeat in that form. Yeah. So you have to find a way of once saying day, the next line, if it's the end of the verse, has to finish with day again. And then the next line has to finish with meal. So once you've written that first verse, you can write down all of the end words for the whole of that section, the rest of the poem. And then you've got this 3-line envoy at the end that looks like that. It's called an envoy. And that has to have all 6 key words in it. Yeah. It's a fiendishly difficult form to write. So here we are. We were talking about more using complex forms. She's using syllabics and rhyme. What Hecht is doing is using pentameter and the sestina. Now, what if you were doing that? If you were talking to someone and you kept saying meal, walk, to, have, camp, day, day, camp, have, to, walk, meal, meal, walk, to, have, camp, day, meal, walk, to, camp, day. Do you see what it's doing? It's embodying somebody trying to talk about something that they can't get out of. They're stuck in this terrible return of meal, walk, to, have, camp, day, meal, walk, to, have, camp, day. They can't get out of it. They keep on. It's like somebody knocking on a door all the time that never opens. Yeah. So the form is about something that is obsessive, something that you can't stop thinking about. So you have to keep going over the same words, and you see how wonderfully the form is an expression of the content. This is someone who's been haunted by experiences of meeting children and adults in this most awful moment and going over it again and again in his mind, reading all about the Holocaust again and again in his mind, trying to, I don't know, you can't come to terms with it, but he has to make something out of it. We all have to make something out of it. There we have, and I hope this is touching on the purpose of poetry. There we have Marianne Moore trying to make something of her life, her poverty, her rather overbearing and very protective mother, her father's terrible story, her probable lesbianism in a time where that hatchet strokes. She's got to make something out of it, and she makes the fish. Hecht has had his own horrors that haunted him this whole life, and he makes something out of it. He makes his sestina, this wonderful sestina. So I'll read this again, and hopefully by now you start to see a bit more what he's doing. I just wanted to mention one other word. Oh yes, do you see with that word "to," which is a repeating word, he changes it to tattoo. 1942, two with a double O. So that's the only word he slightly plays on, but very, it's still two. It's just beautiful little play on that. Heaney has written a famous sestina called Two Lorries, and he plays with it much more. He uses rhyme words and all sorts of things, whereas Hecht is much stricter on himself. He wants to be strict on himself because he doesn't want to indulge anything. Yeah, he doesn't want to indulge his feelings about this, aware of the enormity of what he's writing about. So he chooses a strict form that forces him to speak. Just the other word I wanted to bring into your awareness is the word shamble. Jollik, who had bad lungs, who wasn't a day over 5 years old, commanded to leave his meal and shamble between armed guards to his long home. That's a terrible word to put. So do you remember saunter was used? Very poetic word about a walk. You saunter down Fern Hill and then made to walk and now shamble. And remember that then evokes a butcher's shambles, the terror of a butcher's shamble, brilliantly and terrifyingly placed word, that now children are made to shamble between armed guards. So I'll read this and then we'll have a break and something special might happen. And I hope, and then we'll come back from a break, from about 8-minute break, and I'll read you just two more poems by two more poets. The Book of Jollik. The doused coals fume and hiss after your meal of grilled brook trout, and you saunter off for a walk down the fern trail. It doesn't matter where to, just so long as you're weeks and worlds away from home and among midsummer hills have set up camp in the deep bronze glories of declining day. You remember peacefully an earlier day in childhood. Remember a quite specific meal, a corn roast and bonfire in summer camp. That summer you got lost on a nature walk, more than you dared admit you thought of home. No one else knows where the mind wanders to. The 5th of August, 1942, it was morning and very hot. It was the day they came at dawn with rifles to the home for Jewish children, cutting short the meal of bread and soup, lining them up to walk in close formation off to a special camp. How often you have thought about that camp, as though in some strange way you were driven to, and about the children and how they were made to walk. Jollik, who had bad lungs, who wasn't a day over 5 years old, commanded to leave his meal and shamble between armed guards to his long home. We're approaching August again. It will drive home the regulation torments of that camp Jollik was sent to, his small, unfinished meal, the electric fences, the numeral to 2, the quite extraordinary heat of the day. They were all forced to take that terrible walk. Whether on a silent, solitary walk or among crowds, far off or safe at home, you will remember helplessly that day and the smell of smoke and the loudspeakers of the camp. Wherever you are, Jollik will be there too. His unuttered name will interrupt your meal. Prepare to receive him in your house someday. Though they killed him in the camp they sent him to, he will walk in as you're sitting down to a meal. So we'll have a short break. You can get yourself a cup of tea. Such a terrifying poem, but I think a vitally important poem. So let's have a cup of tea, and we'll start again in about 8 minutes' time. And something might happen that's beautiful in the meantime. So thank you very much, Matt, for that very, very beautiful playing. Really beautiful to have that. Really lovely. Thank you very much. And we'll be hearing some more of that from when we have our break before the ritual this evening. So yes, we're exploring poetry. And it seems Siddhartha Matti was actually saying to me, oh, well, that sort of leads very well. This is like a day of imagination today. We're having poetry, we've had drawing, had a meditation, and we're going to finish with a ritual. And what Buddhist ritual is saying that is imagination can go much further than you think into a world that we usually sort of rope off as religious or even mystical. But actually, it's the same movement of imagination. So we'll be hearing more of Matt in the break. Before that, we'll finish this poetry exploration, I suppose. It's about 10 to 9, something like that. We'll see and see how much I have to say. We'll definitely be finished by then, but we might be finished earlier. And then we'll have a break of 10 minutes, and then we'll conclude our last day of the retreat, if you're on the retreat, with this ritual. Okay, I hope that by now you're getting a sense of the purpose of poetry. Of course, the word purpose is problematic because when we think of something having a purpose, we think of it having utility. Nearly everything that's the most important things for human beings don't have utility in that sense. Value is, for instance, the way you know something's a value is because it's an end in itself. It's not for something else. So no one says, what's the value of kindness? Or what's the value of generosity or truthfulness? Because they're ends in themselves. Poetry, similarly, at its rare best, is an end in itself. Yeah? But you see how the poet is making something enduring that tells you what it's like to be alive in this world, not from the outside, but from the inside. The hope of poetry is for the individual voice to reach across and touch everyone. It's an impossible aim, really. But how can one person possibly speak for everyone, or even a lot of people? But what great poetry does at its rare best, and it is a rare thing, poetry, if you take it seriously, the individual voice can touch people completely removed in time, in space, and so on, who've never experienced those things, but are given some sort of glimpse into that experience. So I want to now talk about this wonderful poet, one of my favorite poets, Elizabeth Bishop. I've had a sort of long love affair with Elizabeth Bishop. Everybody, I talk to all of my friends, I try and convince them to read Elizabeth Bishop. And it's not that difficult because there's not that much poetry. She only a few collections, collected poems are pretty thin. I mean, even this lovely Library of America book is pretty thin, and this has prose and letters in it as well. So she actually reminds me a little bit of Larkin, the English poet. Not a great big body of work, but pretty much every poem is brilliant. Larkin is, I remember talking to Hugo Williams, the English contemporary poet, wonderful poet. He was saying he thought that basically modern poetry, you had Larkin and you had Elizabeth Bishop. Those are the two great exemplars. That was his view anyway. So once again, same program. I'll just read a poem. This poem is from her last collection, Geography 3. What an awful title that always seems to me. Who would come up with that? Anyway, that was the title of her collection, Geography 3. She died only, I think, 2 years after it was published. She was born in 1911 and died in 1979. She'd actually died suddenly of an aneurysm whilst preparing to go out for dinner in Boston. She died very, very suddenly. And that was about 2 years after she published Geography 3, which many people think of as her greatest collection. That's as far as we've got to by then in the book. So there's not much work, and we'll see why in a minute. So I'll read the poem, and once again, we'll just explore it, do a close reading of it. Some of you will know this, many of you won't. I hope many of you won't. I hope it's your first. How many people have we got here just now?
We have 190 people with us.
That's great, isn't that wonderful? I've never known a poetry event which has 190 people. So congratulations. This could be a world record. We could get into the Guinness Book of Records with this. Anyway, that might be exaggerating, but I once read in a poetry, and I would say to somebody, it wasn't literally one person and his dog, but it was pretty near. I think there was me, the other two readers, and I think 2 other people. Wasn't a great night. Anyway, so don't expect crowds if you go to poetry reading. Yeah. Okay, so Elizabeth Bishop, One Art. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day, except the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster, places and names and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. I lost my mother's watch, and look, my last, or next to last, of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I miss them, but it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love. I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master. Though it may look like, write it like disaster. Yeah, so that's Elizabeth Bishop's poem, One Art. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Yeah. So a little bit about Elizabeth Bishop. I mean, I think pretty much anything written by her is good. Her stories are wonderful. There's a wonderful story called The Scream, which is pitch perfect. Her poems are, each one of them, memorable individual objects, hardly a poem alike. She's very like Larkin in that way. But again, with this, a very tragic, in her case, backstory, life story. I actually interviewed the first person who ever wrote a biography of, wrote a study of Elizabeth Bishop, Anne Stevenson. And she wrote in a letter to Anne Stevenson, I have a classic, what was it, the word she, I can't remember, I have a classic awful childhood, but don't think I dote on it. I really like that, but don't think I dote on it. I can't remember quite what the word, but that was the word she used in the second half, but don't think I dote on it. And she did. She indeed had a very, very difficult childhood and life in many ways. So her father died when she was 8 months old. Like her mentor, Marianne Moore, she never met her father, or at least she won't remember her father. Interesting that Marianne became her mentor. So her father died when she was eight months old. Her mother was very, very mentally ill and went completely was very, very mentally ill and was put in an asylum when Elizabeth was only 5. The story, The Scream, is about a child whose mother is effectively going mad, and it starts with this scream. Her mother was put into Elizabeth Bishop's mother was put into asylum. I think she was there until Bishop was 19, but Elizabeth Bishop never saw her again. Never saw her again. She was brought up by. She was effectively orphaned by the time she was 5. Imagine that. She was brought up by her maternal grandparents, who seem to have sort of saved her life. I've read a few biographies of Elizabeth Bishop. I've read a lot of Elizabeth Bishop. I've also read studies of Bishop, particularly Helen Vendler. I'd particularly recommend Helen Vendler. In fact, I just wrote to her the other day, asking again if I could interview her online. I think she is the great poetry critic. And she said, I'm not fond of being interviewed. And at 87, I want to concentrate on more important things, effectively. And I thought, good on you. Quite right, too. Anyway, I particularly value her close readings. Wonderful. I think she is the great critic. Anyway, where was I? Yeah, so she saw her mother, Elizabeth Bishop saw her mother for the last time when she was 5 or 6. She was brought up by her maternal grandparents, who were lovely to her, but not very, her maternal grandparents seem to have been just lovely, ordinary, poorish folks, let her do what she wanted. She loved it. She was very free to roam about, had bare feet. I don't know. This was in a great village in Nova Scotia. Her paternal grandparents were a bit posher, and they came to visit her one time, and they were horrified to see her eating at the table with the adults and having bare feet and looking scruffy. So they took her away to Boston for 9 months. In that time, she got eczema, she got asthma. She said it nearly killed her, that 9 months. And eventually, then she was palmed off to another relative. So basically, she was orphaned. There's even in one biography I've read, there's a quite strong suspicion of sexual abuse when she was a child. you know, and then it didn't stop there. For instance, somebody proposed, she had a relationship with a man. He proposed to her. She eventually cut it off. She eventually said, "No, I can't get married to you." He committed suicide. And a few days after he committed suicide, she received a postcard from him that said, "Elizabeth, go to hell." This, you know, and then later on in life, she's a lesbian. She comes out as a lesbian again at a very, very difficult time to come out as a lesbian. She has a lover in Brazil, and that lover eventually commits suicide as well. She was also, I don't know whether you'd call her an alcoholic now, but she had a drink problem, as they used to call it. She used to binge drink and get very, very drunk. So when you hear that backstory, you suddenly start to see some of the meanings of this poem. And you see how her tone is determinedly cheerful and even flippant. The poem is masquerading itself as a flippant autobiography. Now, people are flippant either because they're trivial people, and Elizabeth Bishop certainly wasn't a trivial person, or because they don't want it, they can't bear to say it. They're flippant to keep it at a distance. It's a distancing effect. So this rather flippant autobiography that she's written, this is late in her life, but notice the tone she starts with. The art of losing isn't hard to master. And they think, oh, that all seems very, even this gorgeous sound, notice how beautiful the sound is. And you see how natural it is. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Perfect pentameter line. It's got a very clear rhyme. It's a villanelle. I won't go on into the form, but the form is very important. I've said enough about it. So it's another closed form. She plays with it much more. It's usually it's supposed to have two repeated lines that repeat in a set place. She has a repeated line, and she uses the word disaster as the other repeated line. So like Heaney, who she knew and writes about, who she met only very briefly, uses it more creatively in a way, in a certain sense. But notice the sound. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. But what you don't realize is that she's immediately set up that rhyme, master, disaster. So the whole poem, you don't know it's a villanelle at first, but the whole poem becomes a duel, a standoff between master and disaster. Can I master it, or is it a disaster? Now, the word disaster comes from the original meaning of it is when the stars, as it were, fully turned against you. Disasters are final. Something you don't live through, a disaster. Yeah. So she's setting off this word, this final word of disaster. That's a final word. That's when the universe turns irrevocably against you, and she's setting that against master. Yeah, but it's so carefully disguised. And one of the things that Bishop does is she disguises all the stuff. Robert Lowell, a great friend of hers, said that she lived her life in disguise as an ordinary woman. And you feel in this verse, this first verse, this three-line verse, the art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day, except the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Do you see how beautiful, casual, everyday that is? Like, accept the fluster of lost door keys. I think that's a wonderful line because it makes you think this is a comic poem. This is one of those small poems. It's literally a small poem. It's not very long. Something's happening. I'm being told to carry on. Something's happened. I've been turned up or down, one of the things. So accept the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. We've all been there, haven't we? We've all had, that irritation when you lose something like a door keys and you lose an hour trying to find the wretched things. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So it all sounds perfectly straightforward. And then she just tiptoes into something a bit stronger. Then practice losing farther, losing faster. Places and names and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. So it's very subtle. One of the things that people don't realize about Bishop is just how subtle she is. So you can miss it really easily. When I first read this poem, I thought it was actually a pretty light poem. I didn't really get much sense that it had any deeper themes to it. And that's part of her quite explicit aim. She won't dote on suffering. There's something to learn from Bishop, I think, in this. She acknowledges suffering, and she acknowledges it actually, if you read it deeply, very, very straightforward, but she won't indulge it. She won't dote on it because she knows that that's not going to help her, not for a moment. If she indulges in that pain, she is lost. She's had a terrible life in many, many ways. I mean, she became a very successful poet, but had a very difficult life. She had happy phases, but very, very difficult life. And that's one of the reasons, presumably, why there's so few poems. But she won't indulge it. Her life is too difficult to indulge. It's too dangerous to indulge. And then practice losing farther, losing faster, places and names and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. Where it was you meant to travel for Bishop is a great metaphor in itself. She traveled a lot, and one of her collections is called Questions of Travel. And this collection is called Geography 3. She was never at home. What did home mean to her, But none of these will bring disaster. And then she says in the next, and again, she jumps the white space of the verse breaks, and she says, I lost my mother's watch. Now, if you don't know her story, that's sad, but not tragic. When you know the story, that's deeply tragic. I lost my mother's watch. It's the last memento she had of her mother, and she lost it. And she seems to have had some memories of her mother when Elizabeth was a little girl, and she had this memento of a watch, and she lost it. Imagine losing your mother's watch in these circumstances. I lost my mother's watch. But you see how the reader, you think, oh yeah, that's a shame, because you can imagine that your mother might be dead, but you can't quite. What that means for the writer, for Bishop in this moment, is tragic, but she won't indulge it. She won't go on about it. I lost my mother's watch. And look, my last or next to last of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. That lovely, notice that wonderful rhyme. She's rhymed master with last or. Yeah? Last or, master. Yeah? So it's a villanelle has got a strict rhyme scheme as well. It's as difficult very few people write villanelles. I've tried writing 2. They're both rubbish. Most people, apart from Wendy Cope, I hope you're listening, Wendy. I've interviewed you here at Poetry. She's written quite a few villanelles, but most people only write 1 or 2. They're so difficult. It's very strict form. Look it up. Very strict form, strict rhyming scheme. It has to say everything in a very small space. Most people only write 1 or 2 if they write any. I hope to write one day, but anyway, never mind. It's not about me. And look, my last or I love that line. Last or next to last, 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones. And that's a very typical Bishopism. I lost 2 cities. Then thought about it a bit more. Lovely ones. Very conversational, very natural. She's not trying to, if she's lulling you into the fence, she's just chatting to you. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones. And vaster, some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster. Now again, I lost 2 cities, lovely ones. This is all about having to move from place to place. And then even more tragic and vaster, some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster. Now, what she's talking about there, she's talking about Brazil. 2 rivers, a continent, some realms I owned. So that was this love affair she had, this big love affair she had in Brazil. She lived with Lota, her name was, who committed suicide. So I lost I lost a whole continent when I lost you. She has to stick to the form, so she has to say, I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster. Do you see how the force of this poem, Master Disaster, is very, very gradually, very subtly building up weight? I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster. In other words, I got through it. It didn't kill me. That, I lost my mother's watch. That could have killed me, because that's that could have killed me, but it didn't. It wasn't a disaster. I lived through it. I could make something of it. I lost 2 rivers, a continent. I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster. Think how tragic that is. And then the last 4-line verse, because that's what you get in a villanelle, even losing you. See how suddenly it's a change of register. It's actually, in this subtlety of the poem, quite a shock. Even losing you. Then in brackets, the joking voice, a gesture I love. And then this incredible line, I shan't have lied. Very unusual line. It took her a long time to get that line. You've got all the drafts. She wrote this for her pretty quickly. Bishop there's another wonderful poem by Bishop called The Moose. If you haven't read it, put that on your list now. Wonderful, wonderful poem. That took her 20 years to write. She had the first few verses and the last few, and it took her 20 years to fill in the whole journey. This poem she wrote fairly quickly, and you've got drafts of it. You can see the drafts. And it took her a long time to find that I shan't have lied, because she's fitting this into this very small form of the villanelle with these strict rules and in strict pentameter. I shan't have lied. Very strange thing. I shan't have lied. And then she seems to sort of darken, even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love. I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing is not too hard to master. So it's like she's trying to pick herself up again. Though it may look like, and then in brackets, write it like disaster. And the word write is italicized. Though it may look like, bracket, like disaster. So do you see that the force of the poem is saying, can I master all these things that have hurt me? This happened. It was terrible, but it wasn't a disaster. This happened. That was terrible. It wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, it's not too hard to master, though it may look like, and then she even repeats the like, doesn't she? It may look like, write it, like disaster. So it's basically saying, I think it's going to be a disaster if I lose you. Now, it's interesting, Wendler reads this as an end-of-life poem, the poet looking back on her life, almost prefiguring her death, that losing her new lover, that she had a new woman, who was one of her students, her love for her, that she would lose that. I always think of it as the possibility that this woman might walk out on her, and that this time she really thinks it could kill me, even losing you. Perhaps they've had this argument, you've all been there, so they walk out, that's it, that's the end. And you really think, I might not be able to survive this. I've survived this and this and this, and I might not be able to survive it. But you see that it's called one art, and it's the art of Stoicism. But Stoicism is not usually thought of as an art, it's thought of as a practice. But the reason it's an art is because her way of managing it is to write. That's her way, that's been her redemption, is redemption through form. She's found a way of making something of it. That's what poetry is making the best of it. If you can make something out of a life that's been as difficult as hers and make something as beautiful, casual, deep, and enduring as this poem, you will have made something out of life. Yeah. So I'll read it one more time, and then we'll finish with one more poem and one more poet. One art. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day, except the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster, places and names and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. I lost my mother's watch, and look, my last or next to last of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I miss them, but it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love, I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master. Though it may look like, write it like disaster. Okay, hope you've got space for one more. We've only done 5 poems tonight, and we've only looked carefully at, we're only going to be look carefully at 4 of them. Have I? We've done 3. This is going to be the 4th. Anyway, there we go. Numbers is a famous problem for me. I was interviewing Sigrid Nunez just the other day, and I was trying to work out what time it was in New York. And I got it. I thought it. Anyway, I got it hopelessly wrong. So I gave her the wrong time. She got the wrong time. Her and I both agreed that we weren't great on numbers. But she's great. She's a great writer, Sigrid Nunez. So do read her book and have a look at the interview. It's a lovely interview. So I'm going to read a poem by James Merrill, who's my current love affair. I'm reading Langdon Hammer's humongous biography of Merrill that recently came out, which is a great read, really, really enjoyable. I've just read his selected poems. I'm now working my way through The Changing Light at Sandover, which is 650 pages long. And so far, I'm really enjoying it. It's completely, anyway, I won't go on about that. It'll take us all night, but it's out there. I mean, it's really out there. So again, I'll just read this poem and then explore it a bit, and then we'll finish in time to have a break before the ritual, if you want to stay on. So some of you might want to try out a Buddhist ritual tonight. That'd be lovely. If you want to stay on, just try it out. Just see what you feel like. It's just like poetry. It's just that it's where poetry comes from, for heaven's sake, is ritual. So it's a really good way to make that movement. Of course, you're welcome not to, but you don't need me to tell you that. Poem by James Merrill, late poem by James Merrill. Christmas tree. To be brought down at last from the cold, sighing mountain where I and the others had been fed, looked after, kept still, meant I knew, of course I knew, that it would only be a matter of weeks, that there was nothing more to do. Warmly they took me in, made much of me. The point from the start was to keep my spirits up. I could assent to that. For honestly, it did help to be wound in jewels, to send their colours flashing forth from vents in the deep, fragrant sables that cloaked me head to foot. Over me then, they wove a spell of shining, purple and silver chains, eavesdripping tinsel, amulets, milagros, software of silver, a heart, a little girl, a Model T, 2 staring eyes, the angels, trumpets, Bud and B, the children's names, in clown-like capitals, somewhere a music box whose tiny song, played and replayed, I ended before long by loving. And in the shadow behind me, a primitive IV to keep the whole show going. Yes, what lay ahead was clear. The stripping, the cold street, my chemicals ploughed back into the earth for life to come. No doubt a blessing, a harvest, but one that doesn't bear now or ever dwelling upon. To have grown so thin, needles and bone, the little boy's hands meeting about my spine, the mother's voice holding up wonderfully. No dread, no bitterness, the end beginning. Today's dusk room aglow for the last time with candlelight. Faces love-lit, gifts underfoot. Still to be so poised, so receptive. Still to recall, to praise. So a beautiful poem by James Merrill. James Merrill was born in 1926, died in 1995. He died at the age of 69 of a heart attack, but I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. So Merrill, James Merrill, he's a son of Charles Merrill of Merrill and Lynch, the banker, yeah. So he comes from Merrill Lynch. I think they started at Safeways or something, some supermarket chain, and then moved on to banking and things that I don't really understand, but were fabulously wealthy. So Merrill Lynch, he's a son of Merrill Lynch. In a way, the painful moment in Merrill's life was the divorce of his parents. He's written a wonderful short sonnet sequence called The Broken Home. His father and mother, very, very different characters. But yeah, fabulously wealthy, never had to work in his life. Spent a lot of his time traveling, spent a lot of his time in Athens, for instance. A lovely thing about Merrill, if you see interviews, he's got this gorgeous southern drawl, which is beautiful. When he reads his poem, reads it much better reader than me. Lovely southern drawl. And, people, because one of the things for Lynch is people's prejudice towards his wealth. Yeah, well, I think one of the reasons that we don't hear enough of Merrill, there's a strange sense in which Merrill has never quite crossed the Atlantic. He should be much better read, a bit like Moore in Marianne Moore in another sense. I think it's partly a prejudice about his money. We have all kinds of prejudices, but we don't often count that as a prejudice. We're allowed to have that prejudice. He just said, "I was very lucky. He said he used to find it mortifying, having all that wealth. He just found it mortifying. He was a little prig for a while when he was a boy, but he quite soon got over that. He was very, very generous. And he said he found it mortifying. But what I like about him, he won't feel guilty about it. He just said it was very fortunate. It was like winning the lottery, he said. For a while, it was mortifying. What he did for his life is he wrote poetry. He's got a huge body of work. This is quite a thick selected. The Changing Light of Sandover, about 40 years spent with a Ouija board. It's 650 pages long, as I said. His collected poems is massive. So a huge body of work. So if you tried with Merrill, I'd start with the selected, because he's quite a difficult poet in a certain way. He's like a marriage between someone like Wallace Stevens and Elizabeth Bishop. He was a friend of Elizabeth Bishop's. They were friends. And interestingly, Hecht wrote a beautiful poem about a memorial poem to James Merrill after James Merrill died. And often people think of James Merrill being the person who most learned from Elizabeth Bishop. But you've got this very casual style, but you've also got this very erudite. So it's a very odd mixture between gorgeous language and very casual style, as you'll hear when we read it again. But this is a wonderful poem. So one of the things to say immediately is a form. So it's a shape poem. So can you see the shape? Is that on screen? It's a shape poem. You see, it's half a Christmas tree. It's called Christmas Tree, and it makes on the page half a Christmas tree. So who's a great shape poem? Easter. Can anybody remember? English. Somebody will know online. Who wrote Easter? It's a famous shape poem. So somewhere got that in mind. Anyway, I can't remember. I'll come back. Somebody who knows who wrote Easter, the famous Anglican English poet, whose name has suddenly escaped me. Do let me know. Anyway, so he's got a shape, that kind of tradition in mind. So yeah, it looks like a Christmas tree. Sometimes when you see it online, someone's justified it so it makes a whole Christmas tree, which looks beautiful. It's a bit of a shame because the half a Christmas tree is very important. Yeah. but you'll see it online, and sometimes it's got a whole Christmas tree. Sometimes they've even put a star on top of it, which is one of the things. Of course, it was never in a. It's too late to be in any of the collections. It's in none of the collections. So his last collection was called A Scattering of Salts, and it's not in that. So what's behind this poem? What I love about this poem is it's a double portrait, isn't it? It's a portrait of a Christmas tree. It's a wonderful, description of a Christmas tree speaking to you. And it's an incredible AIDS poem. Merrill was gay. One of the torments of his life was coming to terms with that. He knew he was gay very young. He was very handsome as a young man, very, very, very beautiful looking man. So you've got beautiful, talented and rich. How much prejudice will you get if you're beautiful, talented and rich? Not a problem I've had, but you can imagine it. So, but being gay at the time was something that would have been abhorrent. Yeah. So that created this kind of another theme of his life. And as he got older, he lost an awful lot of weight, and a lot of his friends were dying of AIDS. And of course, at that time, an AIDS diagnosis, at first it meant basically it was a death warrant. You were effectively dead. You would die when it first appeared. In that. I remember those awful adverts on BBC of these BBC television in England of these collapsing tombstones. It was in the 80s. The AIDS virus actually discovered in 1984. But some of the anyway. So it's a wonderful it's a wonderful portrait, and a terribly moving portrait, and a terribly non-indulgent portrait of a rich gay man dying of AIDS. This metaphor of the tree, the Christmas tree. As soon as we have this word Christmas tree, it looks really sweet, doesn't it, and lovely. But of course, when you've got a Christmas tree in your house, it's dead. It looks alive, and you even do something to make it look even more alive, something beautiful. You turn it into an ornament, don't you? Something that children love. I remember the girls I used to make in the Christmas tree, and I just love it, seeing them make the Christmas tree. Children love it, and the children in this poem, Bud and Bee, they're just sort of adoring the Christmas tree. But actually, it's already dead. So do you see how it's a remarkable binocular view? It's trying to say, this is what my life feels like now. I'm already dead, effectively. And he knew that. He died of a heart attack, but it was because AIDS had so badly undermined his health. He was only 69. If you see pictures of him when he was old, he was, wraith thin. And he only had the test when he was getting so thin and other of his friends were dying. It's an incredible portrait of himself. And it's slightly camp, isn't it? All that tinsel and glitter and it's like camp, yeah. So what he's trying to say is, actually, he's the ghost of he feels like that ghost, yeah. He's trying to say, physically, I'm already dead, but emotionally, mentally, I'm really alive. I'm really alive. In fact, I might be more alive than I've ever been in my life. It reminds me of that interview by, what was his name? The playwright. Dennis Potter. That famous interview when he's sipping morphine as he's being interviewed, talking about the blossomingest blossom he'd ever seen. In that interview, you see somebody who's, half dead, like this tree is dead, but incredibly spiritually, humanly alive. And this is a binocular view of saying, I'm both already dead and incredibly alive. He's doing justice to both. Spiritually, mentally, emotionally, he's more alive than ever. But he knows he's dead. Very, very... And then, of course, you have where I and the others had been fed, looked after, kept still. So it's also a reference to all his that huge swathe of men, particularly. He's in America, they're dying of AIDS. Then you think of someone like Tom Gunn's great elegies in The Man with Night Sweats, which I think Tom Gunn's poems in that great collection of some of the greatest modern poems ever written. Things like Lament, I think one of the most moving and wonderful poems that commemorate that last virus. That's a virus I remember. I remember the horrors of that virus. Yeah. So this is both an incredible portrait, and it's so beautifully visual, of a Christmas tree. And you see how he says there was nothing more to do. And you see how, if there's nothing more to do, there's nothing more to achieve, you become an ornament. That life itself is good enough in itself. That being alive, even though he's dead, he just is appreciating it so much. And there's so much appreciation, so much love. If I can write this at the end of my life, as he wrote it at the end of his life, and if I can create something so beautiful, where form again is mirroring content, but it's a shape poem with a religious background of the shape poem, like Easter Wings. That's the poem I was trying to think of, but I still can't think of his name. George Herbert, thank you. At last, it's George Herbert. So he's got George Herbert in mind. That and Easter Wings, George Herbert's poetry generally is beautiful. Actually, Bishop was inspired by Herbert as well. Herbert is a very, very inspirational and wonderful poet. So, yes, anything else to say about it? I mean, you get words like, you get these sections like, for honestly, it did help to be wound in jewels. What a beautiful way of saying, actually, tell you what, being rich was great. Yeah, it was great. I get to wear gorgeous suits. I get to travel lots. It's great. He's not apologizing for. And honestly, it did. And that rather camp. And honestly, darling, and honestly, it did help to be wound in jewels, to send their colours flashing forth. So lovely purple and silver chains, eaves dripping tinsel. It's terribly sort of camp in its own way, in a gorgeous way. These children, Bud and Bee, who then the children in clown-like capitals, which is rather gorgeous. This homely scene, the mother and his children, and some way a music box whose tiny song played and replayed, I ended before long by loving. Presume what it's just his poetry. A little music box, tight, because these little rooms of poems are these little tiny rooms. It doesn't even go over a page. This little room he's trying to make, that he wants it to live forever, this little room, this little music box that I ended before long by loving. He wrote poems from a very, very early age, like 8 or something, and rather, even in the very, very child poems, really, really lovely. And in the shadow behind me, a primitive IV to keep the whole show going. What a marvelous double meaning. So you know that Christmas trees have that little thin flex that goes to the plug and all the lights up all the lights, but also he's got an IV to keep the whole show going of his life. And then he knows, yes, what lay ahead was clear, the stripping, the cold streets, my chemicals plowed back into the earth for lives to come. No doubt a blessing, a harvest, but one that doesn't bear now or ever dwelling upon. Yeah, beautifully understated knowledge that he's going to die, and then to have grown so thin. To see how terribly poetic in the very, very best sense, and terribly meaningful and sad that is. Very short sentence. To have grown so thin, needles and bone. It's wonderful. I mean, wonderful. The little boy's hand meeting about my spine. Because remember, this is a charmed boy who wrote this. He was once a charmed boy who would have had these wonderful Christmas trees and he had these marvelous gifts, that he was bought. The little boy's hands meeting about my spine, the mother's voice, no dread, no bitterness, the end beginning. Today's dusk room aglow for the last time with candlelight, faces love lit, gifts underfoot, and so on, So he knows about the chilling in the dark in the streets and to have grown so thin. But he wants to finish this life by rejoicing. It's not his last poem. He was working on another poem when he died. But it's pretty near the last poem he ever wrote. And let's finish with, I'll just read this wonderful poem again, Christmas Tree, and we'll finish with that. And I'll just say just one or two things to finish, and then we'll have a 10-minute break. Christmas Tree. To be brought down at last from the cold, sighing mountain where I and the others had been fed, looked after, kept still, meant I knew, of course I knew, that it was only a matter of weeks, that there was nothing more to do. Warmly they took me in, made much of me. The point from the start was to keep my spirits up. I could not. For honestly, it did help to be wound in jewels, to send their colours flashing forth from vents in the deep fragrant sables that cloaked me head to foot. Over me then they wove a spell of shining, purple and silver chains, eaves-dripping tinsel, amulets, milagros, software of silver, a heart, a little girl, a Model T, two staring eyes, the angels, trumpets, bud and beer in the children's names, in clown-like capitals. Somewhere a music box whose tiny song played and replayed, I ended before long by loving. And in the shadow behind me, a primitive IV to keep the whole show going. Yes, yes. What lay ahead was clear. The stripping, the cold street, my chemicals ploughed back into the earth for lives to come. No doubt a blessing, a harvest, but one that doesn't bear, now or ever, dwelling upon. To have grown so thin, needles and bone, the little boy's hands meeting about my spine, the mother's voice holding up wonderfully. No dread, no bitterness, the end beginning. Today's dusk room aglow for the last time with candlelight, faces love-lit, gifts underfoot, still to be so poised, so receptive, still to recall, to praise. And how incredible to finish that word, that poem on still to recall, to praise. I've lived this life, and it's gratitude, it's praise, still to recall, faces love-lit. It's interesting, I think Heaney brings that into one of his poems, Flicker Lit. He uses in Circle and District and Circle line, that wonderful sonnet sequence that he wrote. I think he's sort of indicating back to love lit. Okay, so we better wind up. So I hope, you know what, I mean, I love doing this whole thing. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've been able to share some of my love of these marvelous poets, Marianne Moore, Anthony Hecht, Elizabeth Bishop, and James Merrill. I hope you've discovered someone and something to love in that, that these little rooms of poems that are built to be remembered. Auden called his definition of poet, W.H. Auden, his definition of poetry is very simply memorable speech. And I think these are 4 instances of memorable speech. But just before I finish, in a moment we'll have a 10-minute break. Do join the Poetry East mailing list. We have events. We've had many, we've been going for 10 years now with some really wonderful interviews. So we've got many of the interviews, most of the interviews are recorded online, fabulous interviews, Colm Toibin, Wendy Cope, Anthony Gormley, so many others, Richard Haas, Jory Graham, so many, Alice Oswald, so many poets, writers, sculptors, artists, biographers, playwrights, and so on. So do join that list if if you'd like to hear more. We'll be having more online events. And if you do give if you can, do give a donation if you can. So this is part of Poetry East is part of this home retreat we're running from the London Buddhist Centre. The London Buddhist Centre closed its doors and Poetry East closed with it on the 16th of March. So as you can imagine, we've lost an awful lot of income, and since closing, we're trying to create here at the London Buddhist Centre an atmosphere, a culture of generosity, like the guys who are doing the text tonight. They're just doing it on a Saturday night as they're just as volunteers, as friends. So if you can give, that would be great. And Ippolit will post the link underneath in the chat just now. But let's finish now. We'll have a 10-minute break, and Matt again will play for us in that break. So do stretch your legs, do get yourself a drink, and then we're going to conclude the evening and conclude this last day of the home retreat, if you're on the home retreat, with our first longer puja, what's called a sevenfold puja. And again, as I said, poetry arises out of ritual. So let's take poetry back into ritual after a 10-minute break. So I'll see some of you soon, and some of you might be joining us. So see you soon.
So thank you very, very much to Matt, and a big, big thank you to Maitreya Bandhu for a beautiful, I thought beautiful, moving, wonderful evening. I felt very, very moved. I know those poems, and I've heard Maitreya Bandhu talk about those poems before, but tonight seemed particularly special. So yes, thank you to Maitreya Bandhu. And yeah, thank you for Matt. So we come tonight, my name is Yanavacha for those who don't know me. We come tonight to our final puja of this quite fantastic home retreat. Who would have thought, even just a couple of months ago, that we'd be gathered like this? Hundreds of us from all over the world would be gathered for a week, practicing together. So quite wonderful. And tonight it feels appropriate to just finish with a ritual. A ritual that, well, I was thinking when Maitreya Bandhu was saying that poetry is like a voice. I can't remember exactly how he put it. A voice telling us what life is from the inside, telling us what it is to be alive from the inside. A voice reaching across consciousness, across time and space, from one person to another, telling us what it is to be alive from the inside. And I was thinking that a puja is, well, the puja that we'll be reciting, the sevenfold puja, is the voice of a bodhisattva, telling us what it's like to be a bodhisattva from the inside, a voice of somebody who is either enlightened or very close to enlightened. In a way, the distinction probably doesn't mean anything when you're so far advanced on the path. And it's from the inside. So these are the words of a bodhisattva, of the bodhisattva Shantideva. From the verses of the puja, which are taken from his great work, the Bodhicharyavatara, are speaking to us of the sort of will to worship Buddhas, the will to move towards enlightenment for the sake of all beings. And they speak to us across not just time, and he lived in the 8th century, so across 1300 years, but across cultures. Ancient India, Nalanda, the university, the monastery, the great university monastery where he was living, is another world in cultural terms, across culture, across space and time. And so often those words are, they seem foreign to us, they seem very distant to us. But I quite like the fact that they're not just easily accessible. I think a ritual should feel timeless and mysterious, and the potency of a ritual, the power of a ritual, is partly in a bit like poetry, in meaning sort of caught from the corner of our eye rather than looked on full frontal. It's alluded to. How else could an enlightened mind speak to us but to evoke something of the spirit of enlightenment? And I know that if we recite these words with sincerity, with conviction, with commitment, if we try and penetrate into the emotion's the wrong word, the whole spirit behind these words, if we can penetrate into that with a receptive, open heart, the words are, well, last time we did a puja, I said they were transformative, and they are that. Certainly that's been my experience of doing puja. It very often is transformative, not always, but very often. But more than that, they're words that give us a glimpse of wisdom. They give us a glimpse of our true nature. And sometimes, particularly at the end of the puja, it's like we've together risen above our ordinary minds, at least just slightly. At least we've got a hint of our potential that we've created together. And this way of this online retreat, this home retreat, where you'll be hopefully reciting these words after me on your own, in your own home, in your own room, wherever you are, I think has a particular potency. Because when you recite the words, as it were, on your own, it's easier to mean them. If we're in a shrine room with 100 of us reciting these words, it's sometimes easy to go on to autopilot and not take them in. On your own, you have to sort of hear yourself worshipping the Buddhas, confessing your faults, rejoicing in the good done by all beings. May all those who have suffered be happy. Just that simple line, very, very heartfelt but ordinary, simple sentiment. If you can say that with meaning, may all those who have suffered be happy. It has a magical effect. And then, of course, this is particularly special because you'll be hearing your own voice. You'll be hearing my voice, and maybe you'll be hearing the voices of some of us here in the shrine room. There's a few of us from my community in the shrine room, including Maitra Bandhu and Matt, and there's Ipalit and Paramabandhu. So you'll be hearing their voices, but primarily, I guess, you'll be hearing your own voice in the knowledge that there are, how many people are there, Ipalit?
172.
So 172 of us from all over the world reciting these words together. So I think that's just a beautiful way of conducting a ritual. Something about that call and response uniting us, not just in the words we speak and the sounds those words make, but if we say them with feeling, then in our actual minds, we're saying together, may all those who have suffered be happy. Isn't that incredible? That's just that we're making something, we're creating something by doing that, something of, I believe, inestimable value. So in a moment, I'm going to salute the shrine, and you can salute in, I'll be doing it in call and response, so you can salute the shrine, your shrine, if you have a shrine, as we do that. And yes, throughout this puja, if you have a shrine and you want to, you could face the shrine, your shrine, rather than face the screen. But it's entirely up to you. You make yourself comfortable and see if you can sense the 172 of us all around the world, as well as take your imagination into the spirit behind these words, which is the spirit of enlightenment. So the sevenfold puja will have, before the sevenfold puja, Matt will read the 6 verses of the Dhammapada that we've been hearing every night. I believe he'll read them. And then we'll begin the puja. After the worship section, I'll lead us in the Shakyamuni mantra, and those of us here in the shrine room will make offerings. And again, I invite you to make offerings to your own shrine if you want to. After the rejoicing in merit section, Maitreya Bandhu is going to read a poem. It's just a tiny little 4-line poem from a Zen master who I'd never heard of. Anyway, it's beautiful. I think you'll like it. After entreaty and supplication, we'll recite the Heart Sutra in unison. And then we'll have, after transference of merit, the concluding mantras in call and response. And at the very end of the puja, when silence, when I've rung the final bell and there's a sort of magical silence that can descend, let's just sit for a moment, connected across the world, reciting these words of an enlightened bodhisattva. Let's just sit, absorbing the effects of that. And of course, we'll finish, the last verse is a transference of merit and self-surrender. And you could imagine the merit that we've gained collectively from being on retreat, from practicing together, going out into the world, into this world that so needs all the help that we can give. Okay, so I don't think I need to say any more. I'm going to begin by saluting the shrine.
Namo Buddhaya. Namo Buddhaya. Namo Dhammaya. Namo Dhammaya. Namo Sanghaya. Namo Sanghaya. Namo Namah. Namo Namah.
Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows, even as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox drawing the cart. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows, like a shadow that never departs. Those who entertain such thoughts as, they abused me, they beat me, they conquered me, they robbed me, will not still their hatred. Those who do not entertain such thoughts as, they abused me, they beat me, they conquered me, they robbed me, will still their hatred. Not by hatred are hatreds ever pacified here in the world. They are pacified by love. This is the eternal law. Others do not realize that we are all heading for death. Those who realize it will compose their quarrels.
Song for Puja. Worship. With Mandarava, Blue Lotus, and Jasmine.
With Mandarava, Blue Lotus, and Jasmine.
With all flowers pleasing and fragrant.
With all flowers pleasing and fragrant.
And with garlands skillfully woven.
And with garlands skillfully woven.
I pay honor to the princes of the sages.
I pay honor to the princes of the sages.
So worthy of veneration.
So worthy of veneration.
I envelop them in clouds of incense.
I envelop them in clouds of incense.
Sweet and penetrating.
Sweet and penetrating.
I make them offerings of food, hard and soft.
I make them offerings of food, hard and soft.
And pleasing kinds of liquids to drink.
And pleasing kinds of liquids to drink.
I offer them lamps encrusted with jewels.
I offer them lamps encrusted with jewels.
Festooned with golden lotus.
Festooned with golden lotus.
On the paving sprinkled with perfume.
On the paving sprinkled with perfume.
I scatter handfuls of beautiful flowers.
I scatter handfuls of beautiful flowers.
Om Mani Mani Mahamuni Shakyamuni Swaha. 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 Om Muni, Mahamuni, Shakyamuni, Swaha. Om Muni 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 Muni, Mahamuni, Shakyamuni, Swaha. Salutation. As many atoms as there are,
As many atoms as there are,
in the 1,000,000,000 worlds,
in the 1,000,000,000 worlds,
so many times I make reverent salutation
so many times I make reverent salutation
to all the Buddhas of the three eras,
to all the Buddhas of the three eras,
to the Saddharma,
to the Siddhartha,
and to the excellent community.
and to the excellent community.
I pay homage to all the shrines
I pay homage to all the shrines
and places in which the Bodhisattvas have been.
and places in which the Bodhisattvas have been.
I make profound obeisance to the teachers
I make profound obeisance to the teachers
and those to whom respectful salutation is due.
And those to whom respectful salutation is due.
Going for refuge. This very day, I go for my refuge, to the powerful protectors, whose purpose is to guard the universe, the mighty conquerors who overcome suffering everywhere. Wholeheartedly also I take my refuge. In the Dharma they have ascertained, which is the abode of security against the rounds of rebirth. Likewise, in the host of bodhisattvas, I take my refuge. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. Dhammaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. Sanghaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. Dutiyampi buddhaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. Dutiyampi dhammaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. Dutiyampi sanghaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. Tatyampi buddhaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. Tatyampi dhammaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. Tatyampi sanghaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. Pānātipatā Vēramani Sikkhapadam Sammadhiyāmi. Adinadana Vēramani Sikkhapadam Sammadhiyāmi. Kāmesu Miccāchārā Vēramani Sikkhapadam Sammadhiyāmi. Musavada Vēramani Sikkhapadam Sammadhiyāmi. Suramerya Majja Pammadatana Vēramani Sikkhapadam Sammadhiyāmi. Sadhu Sadhu Sadhu. With deeds of loving kindness,
with deeds of loving kindness.
I purify my body
I purify my body
with open-handed generosity.
with open-handed generosity.
I purify my body
I purify my body
with stillness, simplicity, and contentment.
with stillness, simplicity, and contentment.
I purify my body
I purify my body
with truthful communication.
with truthful communication.
I purify my speech
I purify my speech
with mindfulness clear and radiant.
with mindfulness clear and radiant.
I purify my mind.
I purify my mind.
Confession of faults. The evil that I have heaped up
The evil that I have heaped up
through my ignorance and foolishness,
through my ignorance and foolishness,
evil in the world of everyday experience,
evil in the world of everyday experience,
as well as evil in understanding and intelligence,
as well as evil in understanding and intelligence.
all that I acknowledge to the protectors,
All that I acknowledge to the protectors,
standing before them
standing before them,
with hands raised in reverence
with hands raised in reverence,
and terrified of suffering.
and terrified of suffering.
I pay salutations again and again.
I pay salutations again and again.
May the leaders receive this kindly,
May the leaders receive this kindly,
just as it is with its many faults.
just as it is with its many faults.
What is not good, O protectors,
What is not good, O protectors,
I shall not do again.
I shall not do again.
Rejoicing in merit. I rejoice with delight
I rejoice with delight
in the good done by all beings,
in the good done by all beings,
through which they obtain rest,
through which they obtain rest,
with the end of suffering.
with the end of suffering.
May those who have suffered be happy.
May those who have suffered be happy.
I rejoice in the release of beings
I rejoice in the release of beings
from the sufferings of the rounds of existence.
from the sufferings of the realms of existence.
I rejoice in the nature of the Bodhisattva
I rejoice in the nature of the Bodhisattva
and the Buddha,
and the Buddha,
who are protectors.
who are protectors.
I rejoice in the arising of the will to enlightenment
I rejoice in the arising of the will to enlightenment
and the teaching,
and the teaching,
those oceans that bring happiness to all beings
those oceans that bring happiness to all beings
and are the abode of welfare of all beings.
and are the abode of welfare of all beings.
Smoke waved from an incense stick 1,000 years ago brings tears to the eye.
Entreaty and supplication. Saluting them with folded hands,
Saluting them with folded hands,
I entreat the Buddhas in all the quarters.
I entreat the Buddhas in all the quarters.
May they make shine the lamp of the Dharma
May they make shine the lamp of the Dharma.
for those wandering in the suffering of delusion,
For those wandering in the suffering of delusion,
with hands raised folded in reverence.
with hands folded in reverence,
I implore the conquerors desiring to enter nirvana.
I implore the conquerors desiring to enter nirvana.
May they remain here for endless ages,
May they remain here for endless ages,
so that life in this world does not grow dark.
so that life in this world does not grow dark.
The Heart Sutra. The Bodhisattva of compassion, when he meditated deeply, saw the emptiness of all five skandhas, and sundered the bonds that caused him suffering. Here then, form is no other than emptiness, emptiness no other than form. Form is only emptiness, emptiness only form. Feeling, thought, and choice, consciousness itself, are the same as this. All things are by nature void. They are not born or destroyed, nor are they stained or pure, nor do they wax or wane. So, in emptiness, no form, no feeling, thought, or choice, nor is there consciousness. No eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind. No color, sound, smell, taste, touch, or what the mind takes hold of, nor even act of sensing. No ignorance or end of it, nor all that comes of ignorance. No withering, no death, no end of them. Nor is there pain or cause of pain, or cease in pain, or noble path to lead from pain. Not even wisdom to attain. Attainment too is emptiness. So know that the Bodhisattva, holding to nothing whatever, but dwelling in prajna wisdom, is freed of delusive hindrance, rid of the fear bred by it, and reaches clearest nirvana. All Buddhas of past and present, Buddhas of future time, using this prajna wisdom, come to full and perfect vision. Hear then the great Dharani, the radiant peerless mantra, the prajna paramita, whose words allay all pain. Hear and believe its truth. Gate gate paragate, parasangate bodhiswa. Gate gate paragate, parasangate bodhiswa. Gate gate paragate, parasangate bodhiswa. Transference of merit and self-surrender. May the merit gained, in my acting thus, go to the alleviation of the suffering of all beings. My personality throughout my existences, my possessions, and my merit in all three ways. I give up without regard to myself, for the benefit of all beings. Just as the earth and other elements are serviceable in many ways to the infinite number of beings, inhabiting limitless space, so may I become that which maintains all beings, situated throughout space, so that so long as all have not attained to peace. Om Mani Padme Hum.
Om Mani Padme Hum.
Padme Hum. Om Mani Padme Hum. Om Arapajanadi. Om Arapajanadi. Om Arapajanadi. Om Vajrapani Hum. Om Vajrapani Hum. Om Vajrapani Hum. Om Tare Tutare Ture Swaha. Om Tare Tutare Ture Swaha. Om Tare Tutare Ture Swaha. Om Amideva Hrihi. Om Amideva Hrihi. Om Amideva Hrihi. Om Muni Muni Mahamuni Shakyamuni Swaha. Om Muni Muni Mahamuni Shakyamuni Swaha. Om Muni Muni Mahamuni Shakyamuni Swaha. Om Mahom Vajraguru Padma Siddhi Hom. Om Mahom Vajraguru Padma Siddhi Hom. Om Mahom Vajraguru Padma Siddhi Hom. Gate Gate Aragate Arasangate Odi Swaha. Gate Gate Aragate Arasangate Odi Swaha. Gate Gate Aragate Arasangate Bodhi Swaha. Om Shanti.
Samapapasa akaram kusalasa upasampada Sachita Paryadapanam Etan Purana Sasanam Tamam Chare Sucharitam Natam Ducharitam Chare Amachari Sukham Seti Asmim Loke Paramicha Natavata Damadaro Yavata Parupasati Yoche Apan Visuvana Dhamman Kayena Pasati Save Damodaro Otiyo Dhammanapamajati Nati me saranangam Buddho me saranang varang Etena Satchavachena Otu me Jaya Mangalam Nati me saranangam Dhammo me saranang varan Etena Satchavachena Otu me Jaya Mangalam Nati me saranangam Sangho me saranang varan Etena Satchavachena Otu me Jaya Mangalam Namo Buddhaya Namo Dhammaya Namo Sanghaya Sadhu Sadhu Sadhu
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Lovely to perform a puja, do a puja with you. And I hope you'll join for the last morning of the retreat tomorrow morning. That will conclude our week of practice together. Sleep well.